Prefaces of Elsie Venner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Elsie Venner by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Preface. This tale was published in successive parts in the Atlantic Monthly, under the name of The Professor's Story, the first number having appeared in the third week of December, 1859. The critic who is curious in coincidences must refer to the magazine for the date of publication of the chapter he is examining. In calling this a narrative, a romance, the author wishes to make sure of being indulged in the common privileges of the poetic license. Through all the disguise of fiction, a grave scientific doctrine may be detected lying beneath some of the delineations of character. He has used this doctrine as a part of the machinery of his story, without pledging his absolute belief in it to the extent to which it is asserted or implied. It was adopted as a convenient medium of truth rather than as an accepted scientific conclusion. The reader must judge for himself what is the value of various stories cited from old authors. He must decide how much of what has been told he can accept, either as having actually happened or as possible and more or less probable. The author must be permitted, however, to say here, in his personal character, and as responsible to the students of the human mind and body, that since this story has been in progress, he has received the most startling confirmation of the possibility of the existence of a character like that which he had drawn as a purely imaginary conception in Elsie Venner. Boston, January, 1861. A second preface. This is the story which a dear old lady, my very good friend, spoke of as a medicated novel, and quite properly refused to read. I was always pleased with her discriminating criticism. It is a medicated novel, and if she wished to read for mere amusement and helpful recreation, there was no need of troubling herself with a story written with a different end in view. This story has called forth so many curious inquiries that it seems worth while to answer the more important questions which have occurred to its readers. In the first place, it is not based on any well ascertained physiological fact. There are old fables about patients who have barked like dogs or crowed like cocks after being bitten or wounded by those animals. There is nothing impossible in the idea that Romulus and Remus may have imbibed wolfish traits of character from the wet nurse the legend assigned them, but the legend is not sound history, and the supposition is nothing more than a speculative fancy. Still, there is a limbo of curious evidence bearing on the subject of prenatal influences, sufficient to form the starting point of an imaginative composition. The real aim of the story was to test the doctrine of original sin, and human responsibility for the disordered volition coming under that technical denomination. Was Elsie Venner, poisoned by the venom of a crotalus before she was born, morally responsible for the volitional aberrations which, translated into acts, become what is known as sin, and, it may be, what is punished as crime? If, on presentation of the evidence, she becomes, by the verdict of the human conscience, a proper object of divine pity and not of divine wrath, as a subject of moral poisoning, wherein lies the difference between her position at the bar of judgment, human or divine, and that of the unfortunate victim who received a moral poison from a remote ancestor before he drew his first breath? It might be supposed that the character of Elsie Venner was suggested by some of the fabulous personages of classical or medieval story. I remember that a French critic spoke of her as cette pauvre Melusine. I ought to have been ashamed, perhaps, but I had not the slightest idea who Melusine was until I hunted up the story, and found that she was a fairy, who for some offence was changed every Saturday to a serpent from her waist downward. I was of course familiar with Keats's Lamia, another imaginary being, the subject of magical transformation into a serpent. My story was well advanced before Hawthorne's wonderful Marble Faun, which might be thought to have furnished me with the hint of a mixed nature, human with an alien element, was published or known to me, so that my poor heroine found her origin, not in fable or romance, but in a physiological conception fertilized by a theological dogma. I had the dissatisfaction of enjoying from a quiet corner a well-meant effort to dramatize Elsie Venner. Unfortunately, a physiological romance, as I knew beforehand, is hardly adapted for the melodramatic efforts of stage representation. I can therefore say, with perfect truth, that I was not disappointed. It is to the mind and not to the senses that such a story must appeal, and all attempts to render the character and events objective on the stage, or to make them real by artistic illustrations, are almost of necessity failures. The story has won the attention and enjoyed the favor of a limited class of readers, and if it still continues to interest others of the same tastes and habits of thought, I can ask nothing more of it. January 23rd, 1883. Preface to the new edition. I have nothing of importance to add to the two preceding prefaces. The continued call for this story, which was not written for popularity, but with a very serious purpose, has somewhat surprised, and, I need not add, gratified me. I can only restate the motive idea of the tale in a little different language. Believing, as I do, that our prevailing theologies are founded upon an utterly false view of the relation of man to his Creator, I attempted to illustrate the doctrine of inherited moral responsibility for other people's misbehavior. I tried to make out a case for my poor Elsie, whom the most hardened theologian would find it hard to blame for her inherited Ophidian tastes and tendencies. How then is he to blame mankind for inheriting sinfulness from their first parents? May not the serpent have bitten Eve before the birth of Cain, her firstborn? That would have made an excuse for Cain's children, as Elsie's antenatal misfortune made an excuse for her. But what difference does it make in the child's responsibility whether his inherited tendencies come from a snake bite or some other source which he knew nothing about and could not have prevented from acting? All this is plain enough, and the only use of the story is to bring the dogma of inherited guilt and its consequences into a clearer point of view. But, after all, the tale must have proved readable as a story to account for the large number of editions which it has reached. Some readers have been curious about the locality the writer was thought to have in view. No particular place was intended. Some of the characters may have been thought to have been drawn from life, but the personages mentioned are mostly composites, like Mr. Galton's compound photographic likenesses, and are not calculated to provoke scandal or suits for libel. O.W.H., Beverly Farms, Massachusetts, August 3rd, 1891. End of the prefaces. Chapter 1 of Elsie Venner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. Elsie Venner by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Chapter 1. The Brahmin Caste of New England. There is nothing in New England corresponding at all to the feudal aristocracies of the Old World. Whether it be owing to the stock from which we were derived, or to the practical working of our institutions, or to the abrogation of the technical law of honor, which draws a sharp line between the personally responsible class of gentlemen and the unnamed multitude of those who are not expected to risk their lives for an abstraction. Whatever be the cause, we have no such aristocracy here as that which grew up out of the military systems of the Middle Ages. What we mean by aristocracy is merely the richer part of the community, that live in the tallest houses, drive real carriages, not kerriages, kid glove their hands, and French bonnet their ladies' heads, give parties where the persons who call them by the above title are not invited, and have a provokingly easy way of dressing, walking, talking, and nodding to people, as if they felt entirely at home and would not be embarrassed in the least if they met the governor or even the President of the United States face to face. Some of these great folks are really well bred, some of them are only purse proud and assuming, but they form a class and are named as above in the common speech. It is in the nature of large fortunes to diminish rapidly when subdivided and distributed. A million is the unit of wealth now and here in America. It splits into 4 handsome properties, each of these into 4 good inheritances, these again into scanty competences for 4 ancient maidens, with whom it is best the family should die out, unless it can begin again as its great-grandfather did. Now a million is a kind of golden cheese, which represents in a compendious form the summer's growth of a fat meadow of craft or commerce, and as this kind of meadow rarely bears more than 1 crop, it is pretty certain that sons and grandsons will not get another golden cheese out of it, whether they milk the same cows or turn in new ones. In other words, the millionocracy, considered in a large way, is not at all an affair of persons and families, but a perpetual fact of money with a variable human element, which a philosopher might leave out of consideration without falling into serious error. Of course, this trivial and fugitive fact of personal wealth does not create a permanent class, unless some special means are taken to arrest the process of disintegration in the 3rd generation. This is so rarely done, at least successfully, that one need not live a very long life to see most of the rich families he knew in childhood more or less reduced, and the millions shifted into the hands of the country boys who were sweeping stores and carrying parcels when the now decayed gentry were driving their chariots, eating their venison over silver chafing dishes, drinking Madeira chilled in embossed coolers, wearing their hair in powder, and casing their legs in long boots with silken tassels. There is, however, in New England an aristocracy, if you choose to call it so, which has a far greater character of permanence. It has grown to be a caste, not in any odious sense, but, by the repetition of the same influences, generation after generation, it has acquired a distinct organization and physiognomy, which not to recognize is mere stupidity, and not to be willing to describe would show a distrust of the good nature and intelligence of our readers, who like to have us see all we can and tell all we see. If you will look carefully at any class of students in one of our colleges, you will have no difficulty in selecting specimens of 2 different aspects of youthful manhood. Of course, I shall choose extreme cases to illustrate the contrast between them. In the first, the figure is perhaps robust, but often otherwise, inelegant, partly from careless attitudes, partly from ill dressing. The face is uncouth in feature, or at least common, the mouth coarse and unformed, the eye unsympathetic, even if bright. The movements of the face are clumsy, like those of the limbs. The voice is unmusical, and the enunciation as if the words were coarse castings instead of fine carvings. The youth of the other aspect is commonly slender, his face is smooth and apt to be pallid, his features are regular and of a certain delicacy, his eye is bright and quick, his lips play over the thought he utters as a pianist's fingers dance over their music, and his whole air, though it may be timid and even awkward, has nothing clownish. If you are a teacher, you know what to expect from each of these young men. With equal willingness, the first will be slow at learning, the second will take to his books as a pointer or a setter to his field work. The first youth is the common country boy, whose race has been bred to bodily labor. Nature has adapted the family organization to the kind of life it has lived. The hands and feet by constant use have got more than their share of development, the organs of thought and expression less than their share. The finer instincts are latent and must be developed. A youth of this kind is raw material in its first stage of elaboration. You must not expect too much of any such. Many of them have force of will and character, and become distinguished in practical life, but very few of them ever become great scholars. A scholar is, in a large proportion of cases, the son of scholars or scholarly persons. That is exactly what the other young man is. He comes of the Brahmin caste of New England. This is the harmless, inoffensive, untitled aristocracy referred to, and which many readers will at once acknowledge. There are races of scholars among us, in which aptitude for learning and all these marks of it I have spoken of are congenital and hereditary. Their names are always on some college catalogue or other. They break out every generation or two in some learned labor which calls them up after they seem to have died out. At last some newer name takes their place, it may be, but you can inquire a little, and you find it is the blood of the Edwardses or the Chaunceys or the Ellerys or some of the old historic scholars, disguised under the altered name of a female descendant. There probably is not an experienced instructor anywhere in our northern states who will not recognize at once the truth of this general distinction. But the reader who has never been a teacher will very probably object, that some of our most illustrious public men have come direct from the homespun clad class of the people, and he may, perhaps, even find a noted scholar or two whose parents were masters of the English alphabet, but of no other. It is not fair to pit a few chosen families against the great multitude of those who are continually working their way up into the intellectual classes. The results which are habitually reached by hereditary training are occasionally brought about without it. There are natural filters as well as artificial ones, and though the great rivers are commonly more or less turbid, if you will look long enough, you may find a spring that sparkles as no water does which drips through your apparatus of sands and sponges. So there are families which refine themselves into intellectual aptitude without having had much opportunity for intellectual acquirements. A series of felicitous crosses develops an improved strain of blood, and reaches its maximum perfection at last in the large uncombed youth who goes to college and startles the hereditary class leaders by striding past them all. This is nature's republicanism. Thank God for it, but do not let it make you illogical. The race of the hereditary scholar has exchanged a certain portion of its animal vigor for its new instincts, and it is hard to lead men without a good deal of animal vigor. The scholar who comes by nature's special grace from an unworn stock of broad-chested sires and deep-bosomed mothers must always overmatch an equal intelligence with a compromised and lowered vitality. A man's breathing and digestive apparatus (one is tempted to add muscular) are just as important to him on the floor of the Senate as his thinking organs. You broke down in your great speech, did you? Yes, your grandfather had an attack of dyspepsia in '82 after working too hard on his famous election sermon. All this does not touch the main fact. Our scholars come chiefly from a privileged order, just as our best fruits come from well-known grafts, though now and then a seedling apple, like the Northern Spy, or a seedling pear, like the Seckel, springs from a nameless ancestry and grows to be the pride of all the gardens in the land. Let me introduce you to a young man who belongs to the Brahmin caste of New England. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Elsie Venner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ashley M. Elsie Venner by Oliver Wendell Holmes. The Student and His Certificate. Bernard C. Langdon, a young man attending medical lectures at the school connected with one of our principal colleges, remained after the lecture one day and wished to speak with the professor. He was a student of mark, first favorite of his year, as they say of the Derby colts. There are in every class half a dozen bright faces to which the teacher naturally directs his discourse, and by the intermediation of whose attention he seems to hold that of the mass of listeners. Among these someone is pretty sure to take the lead, by virtue of a personal magnetism, or some peculiarity of expression, which places the face in quick sympathetic relations with the lecturer. This was a young man with such a face, and I found, for you have guessed that I was the professor above mentioned, that when there was anything difficult to be explained, or when I was bringing out some favorite illustration of a nice point, as for instance when I compared the cell growth by which nature builds up a plant or an animal, to the glass blower's similar mode of beginning, always with a hollow sphere, or vesicle, whatever he is going to make, I naturally looked in his face and gauged my success by its expression. It was a handsome face, a little too pale perhaps, and would have borne something more of fullness without becoming heavy. I put the organization to which it belongs in Section B of Class 1 of my Anglo-American Anthropology, unpublished. The jaw in this section is but slightly narrowed, just enough to make the width of the forehead tell more decidedly. The mustache often grows vigorously, but the whiskers are thin. The skin is like that of Jacob rather than Esau's. One string of the animal nature has been taken away, but this gives only a greater predominance to the intellectual chords. To see just how the vital energy has been toned down, you must contrast one of this section with a specimen of Section A of the same class. Say, for instance, one of the old-fashioned, full-whiskered, red-faced, roaring, big commodores of the last generation, whom you remember, at least by their portraits, in ruffled shirts, looking as hardy as butchers, and as plucky as bull-terriers, with their hair combed straight up from their foreheads, which were not commonly very high or broad. The special form of physical life I have been describing gives you a right to expect more delicate perceptions and a more reflective nature than you commonly find in shaggy-throated men, clad in heavy suits of muscles. The student lingered in the lecture room, looking all the time as if he wanted to say something in private, and waiting for 2 or 3 others who were still hanging around to be gone. Something is wrong, I said to myself when I noticed his expression. Well, Mr. Langdon, I said to him when we were alone, can I do anything for you today? You can, sir, he said. I am going to leave the class for the present and keep school. Why, that's a pity, and you so near graduating. You better stay and finish this course and take your degree in the spring, rather than break up your whole plan of study. I can't help myself, sir, the young man answered. There's trouble at home, and they could not keep me here as they have done. So I must look out for myself for a while. It's what I've done before, and am ready to do again. I came to ask you for a certificate of my fitness to teach a common school, or a high school if you think I am up to that. Are you willing to give it to me? Willing? Yes, to be sure, but I don't want you to go. Stay, we'll make it easy for you. There's a fund, we'll do something for you perhaps. Then you can take both the annual prizes if you like, and claim them in money if you want more than medals. I have thought it over, he answered, and have pretty much made up my mind to go. A perfectly gentlemanly young man, of courteous address and mild utterance, but means at least as much as he says. There are some people whose rhetoric consists of a slight habitual understatement. I often tell Mrs. Professor that one of her I think it so's is worth the Bible oath of all the rest of the household that they know it so. When you find a person a little better than his word, a little more liberal than his promise, a little more than borne out in his statement by his facts, a little larger indeed than in speech, you recognize a kind of eloquence in that person's utterance not laid down in Blair or Campbell. This was a proud fellow, self-trusting, sensitive, with family recollections that made him unwilling to accept the kind of aid which many students would have thankfully welcomed. I know him too well to urge him, after the few words which imply that he was determined to go. Besides, I have great confidence in young men who believe in themselves, and are accustomed to rely on their own resources from an early period. When a resolute young fellow steps up to the great bully, the world, and takes him boldly by the beard, he is often surprised to find it come off in his hands, and that it was only tied on to scare away timid adventurers. I have seen young men more than once, who came to a great city without a single friend, support themselves and pay for their education, lay up money in a few years, grow rich enough to travel, and establish themselves in life, without ever asking $1 of any person which they had not earned. But these are exceptional cases. There are horse tamers, born so, as we all know; there are women tamers, who bewitch the sex as the Pied Piper bedevilled the children of Hamelin; and there are world tamers, who can make any community, even a Yankee one, get down and let them jump on its back as easily as Mr. Rary's saddle cruiser. Whether Langdon was of this sort or not I could not say positively, but he had spirit, and, as I have said, a family pride which would not let him be dependent. The New England Brahmin caste often gets blended with connections of political influence or commercial distinction. It is a charming thing for the scholar, when his fortune carries him in this way into some of the old families, who have fine old houses, and city lots that have risen in the market, and names written in all the stock books of all the dividend-paying companies. His narrow study expands into a stately library, his books are counted by thousands instead of hundreds, and his favorites are dressed in gilded calf in place of plebeian sheepskin, or its pauper substitutes of cloth and paper. Reverend Jebediah Langdon, grandfather of our young gentleman, had made an advantageous alliance of this kind. Miss Dorothea Wentworth had read one of his sermons which had been printed by request, and became deeply interested in the young author, whom she had never seen. Out of this circumstance grew a correspondence, an interview, a declaration, a matrimonial alliance, and the family of half a dozen children. Wentworth Langdon, Esquire, was the oldest of these, and lived in the old family mansion. Unfortunately, that principle of the diminution of estates by division, to which I have referred, rendered it somewhat difficult to maintain the establishment upon the fractional income which the proprietor received from his share of the property. Wentworth Langdon, Esquire, represented a certain intermediate condition of life not at all infrequent in our old families. He was the connecting link between the generation which lived in ease, and even a kind of state, upon its own resources, and the new brood, which must live mainly by its wits or industry, and make itself rich, or shabbily subside into that lower stratum known to social geologists by a deposit of Kidderminster carpets, and the peculiar aspect of the fossils constituting the family furniture and wardrobe. This slack-water period of a race, which comes before the rapid ebb of its prosperity, is familiar to all who live in cities. There are no more quiet, inoffensive people than these children of rich families, just above the necessity of active employment, yet not in a condition to place their own children advantageously, if they happen to have families. Many of them are content to live unmarried. Some mend their broken fortunes by prudent alliances, and some leave a numerous progeny to pass into the obscurity from which their ancestors emerged, so that you may see on handcarts and cobblers' stall names which, a few generations back, were upon parchments with broad seals, and tombstones with armorial bearings. In a large city this class of citizens is familiar to us in the streets. They are very courteous in their salutations. They have time enough to bow and take their hats off, which, of course, no business man can afford to do. Their beavers are smoothly brushed, and their boots well polished. All their appointments are tidy. They look the respectable walking gentleman to perfection. They are prone to habits. They frequent reading rooms, insurance offices. They walk the same streets at the same hours, so that one becomes familiar with their faces and persons, as a part of the street furniture. There is one curious circumstance that all city people must have noticed, which is often illustrated in our experience of the slack-water gentry. We shall know a certain person by his looks, familiarly, for years, but never have learned his name. About this person we shall have accumulated no little circumstantial knowledge. Thus, his face, figure, gait, his mode of dressing, of saluting, perhaps even of speaking, may be familiar to us. Yet who he is we know not. In another department of our consciousness there is a very familiar name, which we have never found the person to match. We have heard it so often that it has idolized itself, and became one of that multitude of permanent shapes which walk the chambers of the brain in velvet slippers in the company of Falstaff and Hamlet, and General Washington and Mr. Pickwick. Sometimes the person dies, but the name lives on indefinitely. But now and then it happens, perhaps after years of this independent existence of the name and its shadowy image in the brain, on the one part, and the person and all its real attributes, as we see them daily, on the other, that some accident reveals their relation, and we find the name we have carried so long in our memory belongs to the person we have known so long as a fellow citizen. Now the slack. Water gentry are among the persons most likely to be the subjects of this curious divorce of title and reality. For the reason that, playing no important part in the community, there is nothing to tie the floating name to the actual individual, as is the case with the men who belong in any way to the public, while yet their names have a certain historical currency, and we cannot help meeting them either in their haunts or going to and from them. To this class belonged Wentworth Langdon, Esquire. He had been dead-headed into the world some 50 years ago, and had sat with his hands in his pockets staring at the show ever since. I shall not tell you, for reasons before hinted, the whole name of the place in which he lived. I will only point you in the right direction, by saying that there are 3 towns lying in a line with each other, as you go down east, each of them with a port in its name, and each of them having a peculiar interest, which gives it individuality, in addition to the oriental character they have in common. I need not tell you that these towns are Newburyport, Portsmouth, and Portland. The oriental character they have in common consists in their large, square, palatial mansions, with sunny gardens round them. The 2 first have seen better days. They are in perfect harmony with the condition of weakened, but not impoverished, gentility. Each of them is a paradise of demi-fortunes. Each of them is of that intermediate size between a village and a city which any place has outgrown when the presence of a well-dressed stranger walking up and down the main street ceases to be a matter of public curiosity and private speculation, as frequently happens, during the busier months of the year, in considerable commercial centers like Salem. They both have grand old recollections to fall back upon, times when they looked forward to commercial greatness, and when the portly gentlemen in cocked hats, who built their now decaying wharves and sent out their ships all over the world, dreamed that their fast-growing port was to be the Tyre or the Carthage of the rich British colony. Great houses, like that once lived in by Lord Timothy Dexter in Newburyport, remain as evidence of the fortunes amassed in these places of old. Other mansions, like the Rockingham House in Portsmouth, look at the White Horse's Tail before you mount the broad staircase, show that there was not only wealth but style and state in these quiet old towns during the last century. It is not with any thought of pity or depreciation that we speak of them in a certain sense decayed towns. They did not fulfill their early promise of expansion, but they did remain incomparably the most interesting places of their size in any of the 3 northernmost New England states. They have even now prosperity enough to keep them in good condition, and offer the most attractive residences for quiet families, which, if they had been English, would have been lived in a palazzo at Genoa or Pisa, or some other continental Newburyport or Portsmouth. As for the last of the 3 ports, or Portland, it is getting too prosperous to be as attractive as its less northerly neighbors. Meant for a fine old town, to ripen like a Cheshire cheese within its walls of ancient ride, burrowed by crooked alleys and mottled with venerable mold, it seems likely to sacrifice its mellow future to a vulgar material prosperity. Still it remains invested with many of its old charms, as yet, and will forfeit its place among this admirable trio only when it gets a hotel with unequivocal marks of having been built and organized in the present century. It was one of the old square palaces of the north in which Bernard Langdon, the son of Wentworth, was born. If he had had the luck to be an only child, he might have lived as his father had done, letting his meagre competence smolder on almost without consuming, like the fuel in an air-tight stove. But after Master Bernard came Miss Dorothea Elizabeth Wentworth Langdon, and then Master William Pepperell Langdon, and others equally well named, a string of them, looking, when they stood in a row in prayer time, as if they would fit a set of Pandean pipes, of from 3 feet upward in dimensions. The door of the air-tight stove has to be opened, under such circumstances, you may well suppose. So it happened that our young man had been obliged, from an early period, to do something to support himself, and found himself stopping short in his studies by the inability of the good people at home to furnish him the present means of support as a student. You will understand now why the young man wanted me to give him a certificate of his fitness to teach. and why I did not choose to urge him to accept the aid which a meek country boy from a family without anti-revolutionary recollections would have thankfully received. Go he must, that was plain enough. He would not be content otherwise. He was not, however, to give up his studies, and as it is customary to allow half-time to students engaged in school-keeping, that is, to count a year so employed if the student also keep on with his professional studies, as equal to 6 months of the 3 years he is expected to be under an instructor before applying for his degree. He would not necessarily lose more than a few months of time. He had a small library of professional books, which he could take with him. So he left my teaching and that of my estimable colleagues, carrying with him my certificate that Mr. Bernard C. Langdon was a young gentleman of excellent moral character, of high intelligence and good education, and that his services would be of great value in any school, academy, or other institution where young persons of either sex were to be instructed. I confess, that expression either sex ran a little thick, as I may say, from my pen. For, although the young man bore a very fair character, and there was no special cause for doubting his discretion, I considered him altogether too good looking, in the first place, to be let loose in a roomful of young girls. I didn't want him to fall in love just then, and if half a dozen girls fell in love with him, as they most assuredly would, if brought into too near relations with him, why, there was no telling what gratitude and natural sensibility might bring about. Certificates are, for the most part, like ostrich eggs. The giver never knows what is hatched out of them. But once in 1,000 times they act as curses are said to come home to roost. Give them often enough, until it gets to be a mechanical business, and some day or other you will get caught warranting somebody's ice not to melt in any climate, or somebody's razors to be safe in the hands of the youngest children. I had an uneasy feeling after giving this certificate. It might be all right enough, but if it happened to end badly, I should always reproach myself. There was a chance, certainly, that it would lead him or others into danger or wretchedness. Anyone who looked at this young man could not fail to see that he was capable of fascinating and being fascinated. Those large dark eyes of his would sink into the white soul of a young girl as the black cloth sunk into the snow in Franklin's famous experiments. Or, on the other hand, if the rays of passionate nature should ever be concentrated on them, they would be absorbed into the very depths of his nature, and then his blood would turn to flame and burn his life out of him, until his cheeks grew as white as the ashes that cover a burning coal. I wish I had not said either sex in my certificate. An academy for young gentlemen, now, that sounds cool and unimaginative. A boys' school, that would be a very good place for him. Some of them are pretty rough, but there is nerve enough in that old Wentworth strain of blood. He can give any country fellow, of the common stock, £20, and hit him out of time in 10 minutes. But to send such a young fellow as that out a girl's nesting, to give this falcon a free pass into all the dovecotes, I was a fool, that's all. I brooded over the mischief which might come out of these 2 words until it seemed to me that they were charged with destiny. I could hardly sleep for thinking what a train I might have been laying, which might take a spark any day, and blow up nobody knows whose peace or prospects. What I dreaded most was one of those miserable matrimonial misalliances where a young fellow who does not know himself as yet flings his magnificent future into the checked apron lap of some fresh-faced, half-bred country girl, no more fit to be mated with him than her father's horse to go in double harness with Flora Temple. To think of the eagle's wings being clipped so that he shall never lift himself over the farmyard fence! Such things happen, and always must, because, as one of us said a while ago, a man always loves a woman, and a woman a man, unless some good reason exists to the contrary. You think yourself a very fastidious young man, my friend, but there are probably at least 5,000 young women in these United States, any one of whom you would certainly marry, if you were thrown much into her company, and nobody more attractive were near, and she had no objection. And you, my dear young lady, justly pride yourself on your discerning delicacy. But if I should say that there are 20,000 young men, any one of whom, if he offered his hand and heart under favorable circumstances, you would first endure, then pity, then embrace, I should be much more imprudent than I mean to be, and you would, no doubt, throw down in a story in which I hope to interest you. I had settled it in my mind that this young fellow had a career marked out for him. He should begin in the natural way, by taking care of poor patients as one of the public charities, and work his way up to a better kind of practice. Better, that is, in the vulgar, worldly sense. The great and good Boerhaave used to say, as I remember very well, that the poor were his best patients, for God was their paymaster. But everybody is not as patient as Boerhaave, nor as deserving, so that the rich, though not, perhaps, the best patients, are good enough for common practitioners. I suppose Boerhaave put up with them when he could not get poor ones, as he left his daughter 2 millions of florins when he died. Now if this young man once got into the wide streets, he would sweep them clear of his rivals of the same standing, and as I was getting indifferent to business, and old Dr. Killam was growing careless, and had once or twice prescribed morphine when he meant quinine, there would soon be an opening into the doctor's paradise, the streets with only one side to them. Then I would have him strike a bold stroke, setting up a nice little coach, and be driven round like a first-class London doctor, instead of coasting about in a shabby one-horse concern and casting anchor opposite the patient's door like a Cape Ann fishing smack. By the time he was 30 he would have knocked the social ponds out of his way, and be ready to challenge away from the row of great pieces in the background. I would not have a man marry above his level, so as to become the appendage of a powerful family connection, but I would not have him marry until he knew his level. That is, again, looking at the matter in a purely worldly point of view, and not taking the sentiments at all into consideration. But remember that a young man, using large endowments wisely and fortunately, may put himself on a level with the highest in the land in 10 brilliant years of spirited, unflagging labor. And to stand at the very top of your calling in a great city is something in itself. That is, if you like money and influence, and a seat on the platform at public lectures, and gratuitous tickets to all sorts of places where you don't want to go, and, what is a good deal better than any of these things, the sense of power, limited it may be, but absolute in its range, so that all the Caesars and Napoleons would have to stand aside if they came between you and the exercise of your special vocation. That is what I thought this young fellow might have come to, and now I have let him go off into the country with my certificate that he is fit to teach in a school for either sex. 10 to 1 he will run like a moth into a candle, right into one of those girls' nests, and get tangled up in some sentimental folly or other, and there will be the end of him. Oh yes, country doctor, $50 a visit, drive, drive, drive all day, get up at night and harness your own horse, drive again 10 miles in a snowstorm, shake powders out of 2 vials, drive back again, if you don't happen to get stuck in a drift, no home, no peace, no continuous meals, no unbroken sleep, no Sunday, no holiday, no social intercourse, but one eternal jog, 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 and is sulky until you feel like the mummy of an Indian who had been buried in the sitting position and was dug up 100 years afterwards. Why didn't I warn him about love and all that nonsense? Why didn't I tell him he had nothing to do with it yet a while? Why didn't I hold up to him those awful examples I could have cited, where poor young fellows who could just keep themselves afloat have hung a matrimonial millstone round their necks, taking it for a life preserver? All this of 2 words in a certificate. End of chapter 2. Recording by Ashley M.
Chapter 3 of Elsie Venner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Elsie Venner by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Chapter 3. Mr. Bernard Tries His Hand. Whether the student advertised for a school, or whether he fell in with the advertisement of a school committee, is not certain. At any rate, it was not long before he found himself the head of a large district, or, as it was called by the inhabitants, district school, in the flourishing inland village of Pequawket, or, as it is commonly spelt, Pigwacket Center. The natives of this place would be surprised if they should hear that any of the readers of a work published in Boston were unacquainted with so remarkable a locality. As, however, Some copies of it may be read at a distance from this distinguished metropolis. It may be well to give a few particulars respecting the place taken from the Universal Gazetteer. Pigwacket, sometimes spelled Pequawket, a post village and township in County, State of , situated in a fine agricultural region, 2 thriving villages, Pigwacket Centre and Smithville, 3 churches, several schoolhouses, and many handsome private residences. Mink River runs through the town, navigable for small boats after heavy rains. Muddy Pond at northeast section, well stocked with hornpouts, eels, and shiners. Products: beef, pork, butter, cheese. Manufactures: shoe pegs, clothespins, and tinware. Population: 1,373. The reader may think there is nothing very remarkable implied in this description. If, however, he had read the town history by the Reverend Jabez Grubb, he would have learned that, like the celebrated Little Pedlington, it was distinguished by many very remarkable advantages. Thus: the situation of Pigwacket is eminently beautiful, looking down the lovely valley of Mink River, a tributary of the Musquash. The air is salubrious, and many of the inhabitants have attained great age, several having passed the allotted period of 80 before succumbing to any of the various ills that flesh is heir to. Widow Comfort Levens died in 1836, of age 87 years. Venus, an African, died in 1841, supposed to be 100 years old. The people are distinguished for intelligence, as has been frequently remarked by eminent lyceum lecturers, who have invariably spoken in the highest terms of a Pigwacket audience. There is a public library, containing nearly 100 volumes, free to all subscribers. The preached word is well attended, there is a flourishing temperance society, and the schools are excellent. It is a residence admirably adapted to refined families who relish the beauties of nature and the charms of society. The Honorable John Smith, formerly a member of the State Senate, was a native of this town. That is the way they all talk. After all, it is probably pretty much like other inland New England towns in point of salubrity. That is, gives people their choice of dysentery or fever every autumn, with a season ticket for consumption, good all the year round. And so of the other pretenses. Pigwacket audience, forsooth! Was there ever an audience anywhere, though there wasn't a pair of eyes in it brighter than pickled oysters, that didn't think it was distinguished for intelligence? The preached word! That means the Reverend Jabez Grubb's sermons. Temperance society, excellent schools. Ah, that is just what we were talking about. The truth was that District No. 1, Pigwacket Centre, had had a good deal of trouble of late with its schoolmasters. The committee had done their best, but there were a number of well-grown and pretty rough young fellows who had got the upper hand of the masters and meant to keep it. 2 dynasties had fallen before the uprising of this fierce democracy. This was a thing that used to be not very uncommon, but in so intelligent a community as that of Pigwacket Centre, in an era of public libraries and lyceum lectures, it was portentous and alarming. The rebellion began under the ferule of Master Weeks, a slender youth from a country college, underfed, thin-blooded, sloping-shouldered, knock-kneed, straight-haired, weak-bearded, pale-eyed, wide-pupilled, half-colored, a common type enough in indoor races, not rich enough to pick and choose in their alliances. Nature kills off a good many of this sort in the first teething time, a few in later childhood, a good many again in early adolescence, but every now and then one runs the gauntlet of her various diseases, or rather forms of one disease, and grows up, as Master Weeks had done. It was a very foolish thing for him to try to inflict personal punishment on such a lusty young fellow as Abner Briggs, Jr., one of the hardest customers in the way of a rough-and-tumble fight that there were anywhere round. No doubt he had been insolent, but it would have been better to overlook it. It pains me to report the events which took place when the master made his rash attempt to maintain his authority. Abner Briggs, Jr., was a great hulking fellow who had been bred to butchering, but urged by his parents to attend school in order to learn the elegant accomplishments of reading and writing, in which he was sadly deficient. He was in the habit of talking and laughing pretty loud in school hours, of throwing wads of paper reduced to a pulp by a natural and easy process, of occasional insolence and general negligence. One of the soft but unpleasant missiles, just alluded to, flew by the master's head one morning, and flattened itself against the wall, where it adhered in the form of a convex mass in alto relievo. The master looked round and saw the young butcher's arm in an attitude which pointed to it unequivocally as the source from which the projectile had taken its flight. Master Weeks turned pale. He must lick Abner Briggs, Jr., or abdicate. So he determined to lick Abner Briggs, Jr. "Come here, sir," he said. "You have insulted me and outraged the decency of the schoolroom often enough. Hold out your hand." The young fellow grinned and held it out. The master struck at it with his black ruler, with a will in the blow and a snapping of the eyes, as much as to say that he meant to make him smart this time. The young fellow pulled his hand back as the ruler came down, and the master hit himself a vicious blow with it on the right knee. There are things no man can stand. The master caught the refractory youth by the collar and began shaking him, or rather shaking himself against him. "Let go o' that 'ere coat now," said the fellow, "or I'll make ye. It'll take two on yet handle me, I tell ye, and then ye can't do it." And the young pupil returned the master's attention by catching hold of his collar. When it comes to that, the best man, not exactly in the moral sense, but rather in the material, and more especially the muscular point of view, is very apt to have the best of it, irrespectively of the merits of the case. So it happened now. The unfortunate schoolmaster found himself taking the measure of the sanded floor, amidst the general uproar of the school. From that moment his ferule was broken, and the school committee very soon had a vacancy to fill. Master Pigeon, the successor of Master Weeks, was of better stature, but loosely put together and slender-limbed. A dreadfully nervous kind of man he was, walking on tiptoe, started at sudden noises, was distressed when he heard a whisper, had a quick, suspicious look, and was always saying, "Hush!" and putting his hands to his ears. The boys were not long in finding out about this nervous weakness, of course. In less than a week a regular system of torments was inaugurated, full of the most diabolical malice and ingenuity. The exercises of the conspirators varied from day to day, but consisted mainly of foot-scraping, solos on the slate pencil, making it screech on the slate, falling of heavy books, attacks of coughing, banging of desk lids, boot creaking, with sounds as of drawing a cork from time to time, followed by suppressed chuckles. Master Pigeon grew worse and worse under these afflictions. The rascally boys always had an excuse for any one trick they were caught at. "Couldn't help coughin', sir." "Slipped out o' my hand, sir." "Didn't go to, sir." "Didn't do it a purpose, sir," and so on, always the best of reasons for the most outrageous of behavior. The master weighed himself at the grocer's on a platform balance some 10 days after he began keeping the school. At the end of a week he weighed himself again. He had lost 2 pounds. At the end of another week he had lost 5. He made a little calculation based on these data, from which he learned that in a certain number of months, going on at this rate, he should come to weigh precisely nothing at all. And as this was a sum in subtraction, he did not care to work out in practice, Master Pigeon took to himself wings and left the school committee in possession of a letter of resignation and a vacant place to fill once more. This was the school to which Mr. Bernard Langdon found himself appointed as master. He accepted the place conditionally, with the understanding that he should leave it at the end of a month, if he were tired of it. The advent of Master Langdon to Pigwacket Centre created a much more lively sensation than had attended that of either of his predecessors. Looks go a good way all the world over, and though there were several good-looking people in the place, and Major Bush was what the natives of the town called a handsome man, that is, big, fat, and red, yet the sight of a really elegant young fellow, with the natural air which grows up with carefully bred young persons, was a novelty. The Brahmin blood which came from his grandfather, as well as from his mother, a direct descendant of the old Flint family, well known by the famous tutor Henry Flint, C. Cat Harve Anno 1693, had been enlivened and enriched by that of the Wentworths, which had had a good deal of ripe old Madeira and other generous elements mingled with it, so that it ran to gout sometimes in the old folks, and to high spirit, warm complexion, and curly hair in some of the younger ones. The soft curling hair Mr. Bernard had inherited, something perhaps of the high spirit, but that we shall have a chance of finding out by and by. But the long sermons and the frugal board of his Brahmin ancestry, with his own habits of study, had told upon his color, which was subdued to something more of delicacy than one would care to see in a young fellow with rough work before him. This, however, made him look more interesting, or, as the young ladies at Major Bush's said, interestin'. When Mr. Bernard showed himself at meeting, on the first Sunday after his arrival, it may be supposed that a good many eyes were turned upon the young schoolmaster. There was something heroic in his coming forward so readily to take a place which called for a strong hand and a prompt, steady will to guide it. In fact, his position was that of a military chieftain on the eve of a battle. Everybody knew everything in Pigwacket Centre, and it was an understood thing that the young rebels meant to put down the new master if they could. It was natural that the two prettiest girls in the village, called in the local dialect, as nearly as our limited alphabet will represent it, Almany Cutter and Arvely Brown, should feel and express an interest in the good-looking stranger, and that when their flattering comments were repeated in the hearing of their indigenous admirers, among whom were some of the older boys of the school, it should not add to the amiable dispositions of the turbulent youth. Monday came, and the new schoolmaster was in his chair at the upper end of the schoolhouse, on the raised platform. The rustics looked at his handsome face, thoughtful, peaceful, pleasant, cheerful, but sharply cut round the lips and proudly lighted about the eyes. The ringleader of the mischief-makers, the young butcher who has before figured in this narrative, looked at him stealthily whenever he got a chance to study him unobserved. For the truth was, he felt uncomfortable whenever he found the large dark eyes fixed on his own little, sharp, deep-set, grey ones. But he managed to study him pretty well, first his face, then his neck and shoulders, the set of his arms, the narrowing at the loins, the make of his legs, and the way he moved. In short, he examined him as he would have examined a steer, to see what he could do and how he would cut it up. If he could only have gone to him and felt of his muscles, he would have been entirely satisfied. He was not a very wise youth, but he did know well enough that, though big arms and legs are very good things, there is something besides size that goes to make a man, and he had heard stories of a fighting man called the Spider, from his attenuated proportions, who was yet a terrible hitter in the ring, and had whipped many a big-limbed fellow in and out of the roped arena. Nothing could be smoother than the way in which everything went on for the first day or two. The new master was so kind and courteous, he seemed to take everything in such a natural, easy way, that there was no chance to pick a quarrel with him. He, in the meantime, thought it best to watch the boys and young men for a day or two with as little show of authority as possible. It was easy enough to see that he would have occasion for it before long. The schoolhouse was a grim, old, red, one-story building perched on a bare rock at the top of a hill, partly because this was a conspicuous site for the Temple of Learning, and partly because land is cheap, where there is no chance even for rye or buckwheat, and the very sheep find nothing to nibble. About the little porch were carved initials and dates at various heights, from the stature of 9 to that of 18. Inside were old unpainted desks, unpainted but browned with the umber of human contact, and hacked by innumerable jackknives. It was long since the walls had been whitewashed, as might be conjectured by the various traces left upon them, whenever idle hands or sleepy heads could reach them. A curious appearance was noticeable on various higher parts of the wall, namely a wart-like eruption, as one would be tempted to call it, being in reality a crop of the soft missels before mentioned, which, adhering in considerable numbers and hardening after the usual fashion of papier-mâché, formed at last permanent ornaments of the edifice. The young master's quick eye soon noticed that a particular part of the wall was most favored with these ornamental appendages. Their position pointed sufficiently clearly to the part of the room they came from. In fact, there was a nest of young mutineers just there, which must be broken up by a coup d'etat. This was easily effected by redistributing the seats and arranging the scholars according to classes, so that a mischievous fellow, charged full of the rebellious imponderable, should find himself between two non-conductors, in the shape of small boys of studious habits. It was managed quietly enough, in such a plausible sort of way that its motive was not thought of, but its effects were soon felt. And then began a system of correspondence by signs, and the throwing of little scrawls done up in pellets, and announced by preliminary ahem, to call the attention of the distant youth addressed. Some of these were incendiary documents, devoting the schoolmaster to the lower divinities as a stuck-up dandy, as a purse-proud aristocrat, as a sight too big for his, etc., and holding him up in a variety of equally forcible phrases to the indignation of the youthful community of School District No. 1, Pigwacket Centre. Presently the draughtsman of the school set a caricature in circulation, labelled, to prevent mistakes, with the schoolmaster's name. An immense bell-crowned hat and a long, pointed, swallow-tailed coat showed that the artist had in his mind the conventional dandy, as shown in prints of 30 or 40 years ago, rather than any actual human aspect of the time. But it was passed round among the boys and made its laugh, helping of course to undermine the master's authority, as Punch, or the Charivari, takes the dignity out of an obnoxious minister. One morning, on going to the schoolroom, Master Langdon found an enlarged copy of this sketch, with its label, pinned on the door. He took it down, smiled a little, put it into his pocket, and entered the schoolroom. An insidious silence prevailed, which looked as if some plot were brewing. The boys were ripe for mischief, but afraid. They had really no fault to find with the master, except that he was dressed like a gentleman, which a certain class of fellows always consider a personal insult to themselves. But the older ones were evidently plotting, and more than once the warning ahem was heard, and a dirty little scrap of paper rolled into a wad shot from one seat to another. One of these happened to strike the stove funnel, and lodged on the master's desk. He was cool enough not to seem to notice it. He secured it, however, and found an opportunity to look at it, without being observed by the boys. It required no immediate notice. He, who should have enjoyed the privilege of looking upon Mr. Bernard Langdon the next morning, when his toilet was about half finished, would have had a very pleasant gratuitous exhibition. First, he buckled the strap of his trousers pretty tightly. Then he took up a pair of heavy dumbbells and swung them for a few minutes, then 2 great Indian clubs, with which he enacted all sorts of impossible-looking feats. His limbs were not very large, nor his shoulders remarkably broad, but if you knew as much of the muscles as all persons who look at statues and pictures with a critical eye ought to have learned, if you knew the trapezius, lying diamond-shaped over the back and shoulders like a monk's cowl, or the deltoid, which caps the shoulder like an epaulette, or the triceps, which furnishes the calf of the upper arm, or the hard-knotted biceps, any of the great sculptural landmarks, in fact, you would have said that there was a pretty show of them beneath the white satiny skin of Mr. Bernard Langdon. And if you had seen him, when he had laid down the Indian clubs, catch hold of a leather strap that hung from the beam of the old-fashioned ceiling, and lift and lower himself over and over again by his left hand alone, you might have thought it a very simple and easy thing to do, until you tried to do it yourself. Mr. Bernard looked at himself with the eye of an expert. "Pretty well," he said. "Not so much fallen off as I expected." Then he set up his bolster in a very knowing sort of way, and delivered 2 or 3 blows, straight as rulers and swift as winks. "That will do," he said. Then, as if determined to make a certainty of his condition, he took a dynamometer from one of the drawers in his old veneered bureau. First he squeezed it with his 2 hands, then he placed it on the floor and lifted, steadily, strongly. The springs creaked and cracked. The index swept with a great stride far up into the high figures of the scale. It was a good lift. He was satisfied. He sat down on the edge of his bed and looked at his cleanly shaped arms. "If I strike one of those boobies, I am afraid I shall spoil him," he said. Yet this young man, when weighed with his class at the college, could barely turn 142 pounds in the scale. Not a heavy weight, surely, but some of the middle weights, as the present English champion, for instance, seemed to be of a far finer quality of muscle than the bulkier fellows. The master took his breakfast with a good appetite that morning, but was perhaps rather more quiet than usual. After breakfast he went upstairs and put on a light, loose frock, instead of that which he commonly wore, which was a close-fitting and rather stylish one. On his way to school he met Alminy Cutter, who happened to be walking in the other direction. "Good morning, Miss Cutter," he said, for she and another young lady had been introduced to him on a former occasion, in the usual phrase of polite society in presenting ladies to gentlemen. "Mr. Langdon, let me make ye acquainted with Miss Cutter. Let me make ye acquainted with Miss Brown." So he said, "Good morning," to which she replied, "Good morning, Mr. Langdon. How's your health?" The answer to this question ought naturally to have been the end of the talk, but Alminy Cutter lingered and looked as if she had something more on her mind. A young fellow does not require a great experience to read a simple country girl's face as if it were a signboard. Alminy was a good soul, with red cheeks and bright eyes, kind-hearted as she could be, and it was out of the question for her to hide her thoughts or feelings like a fine lady. Her bright eyes were moist, and her red cheeks paler than their wont, as she said, with her lips quivering, "Oh, Mr. Langdon, them boys'll be the death of ye, if ye don't take care." "Why, what's the matter, my dear?" said Mr. Bernard. "Don't think there was anything very odd in that 'my dear' at the second interview with a village belle. Some of these woman-tamers call a girl 'my dear' after 5 minutes' acquaintance, and it sounds all right as they say it, but you had better not try it at a venture." It sounded all right to Alminy as Mr. Bernard said it. "I'll tell ye what's the matter," she said, in a frightened voice. "Abner's goin' to car his dog, and he'll set him on ye sure as you're alive. 'Tis the same creature that half et up Eben Squire's little Joe a year come next fast day." Now, this last statement was undoubtedly overcolored, as little Joe Squires was running about the village with an ugly scar on his arm, it is true, where the beast had caught him with his teeth, on the occasion of the child's taking liberties with him, as he had been accustomed to do with a good-tempered Newfoundland dog, who seemed to like being pulled and hauled round by children. After this, the creature was commonly muzzled, and, as he was fed on raw meat chiefly, was always ready for a fight, which he was occasionally indulged in, when anything stout enough to match him could be found in any of the neighboring villages. Tiger, or more briefly Tige, the property of Abner Briggs, Jr., belonged to a species not distinctly named in scientific books, but well known to our country folks under the name Yalla dog. They do not use this expression, as they would say black dog or white dog, but with almost as definite a meaning as when they speak of a terrier or a spaniel. A Yalla dog is a large canine brute, of a dingy, old flannel color, of no particular breed except his own, who hangs round a tavern or a butcher's shop, or trots alongside of a team, looking as if he were disgusted with the world, and the world with him. Our inland population, while they tolerate him, speak of him with contempt. Old of Meredith Bridge used to twit the sun for not shining on cloudy days, swearing that if he hung up his Yalla dog he would make a better show of daylight. A country fellow, abusing a horse of his neighbor's, vowed that if he had such a hoss, he'd swap him for a Yalla dog, and then shoot the dog. Tige was an ill-conditioned brute by nature, and art had not improved him by cropping his ears and tail and investing him with a spiked collar. He bore on his person also various not ornamental scars, marks of old battles, for Tige had fight in him, as was said before, and as might be guessed by a certain bluntness about the muzzle, with a projection of the lower jaw, which looked as if there might be a bulldog stripe among the numerous bar sinisters of his lineage. It was hardly fair, however, to leave Alminy Cutter waiting while this piece of natural history was telling. As she spoke of little Joe, who had been half eat up by Tige, she could not contain her sympathies, and began to cry. "Why, my little dear soul," said Mr. Bernard, "what are you worried about? I used to play with a bear when I was a boy, and the bear used to hug me, and I used to kiss him, so." It was too bad of Mr. Bernard, only the second time he had seen Alminy, but her kind feelings had touched him, and that seemed the most natural way of expressing his gratitude. Alminy looked round to see if anybody was near. She saw nobody, so of course it would do no good to holler. She saw nobody, but a stout young fellow leading a yellow dog, muzzled, saw her through a crack in a picket fence, not a great way off the road. Many a year he had been hangin' round Alminy, and never did he see any encouraging look, or hear any "behave now," or "come now, ain't you shamed," or other forbidding phrase of acquiescence, such as village belles understand as well as ever did the nymph who fled to the willows, in the eclogue we all remember. No wonder he was furious when he saw the schoolmaster, who had never seen the girl until within a week, touching with his lips those rosy cheeks, which he had never dared to approach. But that was all. It was a sudden impulse, and the master turned away from the young girl laughing, and telling her not to fret herself about him. He could take care of himself. So Master Langdon walked on towards his schoolhouse, not displeased, perhaps, with his little adventure, nor immensely elated by it, for he was one of the natural class of the sex subduers, and had had many a smile without asking, which had been denied to the feeble youth who tried to win favor by pleading their passion in rhyme, and even to the more formidable approaches of young officers in volunteer companies, considered by many to be quite irresistible to the fair who have once beheld them from their windows in the epaulettes and plumes and sashes of the Pigwacket Invincibles or the Hackmatack Rangers. Master Langdon took his seat and began the exercises of his school. The smaller boys recited their lessons well enough, but some of the larger ones were negligent and surly. He noticed one or two of them looking toward the door as if expecting somebody or something in that direction. At 9:30 o'clock, Abner Briggs, Jr., who had not yet shown himself, made his appearance. He was followed by his Yala dog, without his muzzle, who squatted down very grimly near the door, and gave a wolfish look round the room, as if he were considering which was the plumpest boy to begin with. The young butcher, meanwhile, went to his seat, looking somewhat flushed, except round the lips, which were hardly as red as common, and set pretty sharply. "Put out that dog, Abner Briggs," the master spoke, as the captain speaks to the helmsman, when there are rocks foaming at the lips, right under his lee. Abner Briggs answered as the helmsman answers when he knows he has a mutinous crew round him that mean to run the ship on the reef, and is one of the mutineers himself. "Put him out yourself, if ye ain't afeard on him." The master stepped into the aisle. The great cur showed his teeth, and the devilish instincts of his old wolf ancestry looked out of his eyes, and flashed from his sharp tusks, and yawned in his wide mouth and deep red gullet. The movements of animals are so much quicker than those of human beings commonly are, that they avoid blows as easily as one of us steps out of the way of an ox cart. It must be a very stupid dog that lets himself be run over by a fast driver in his gig. He can jump out of the wheel's way after the tire has already touched him. So while one is lifting a stick to strike or drawing back his foot to kick, the beast makes his spring, and the blow or the kick comes too late. It was not so this time. The master was a fencer and something of a boxer. He had played at single stick, and was used to watching an adversary's eye and coming down on him without any of those premonitory symptoms by which unpractised persons show long beforehand what mischief they meditate. "Out with you," he said fiercely, and explained what he meant by a sudden flash of his foot that clashed the yellow dog's white teeth together like the springing of a bear trap. The cur knew he had found his master at the first word and glance, as low animals on 4 legs, or a smaller number, always do, and the blow took him so by surprise that it curled him up in an instant, and he went bundling out of the open schoolhouse door with a most pitiable yelp, and his stump of a tail shut down as close as his owner ever shut the short, stubbed blade of his jackknife. It was time for the other cur to find who his master. "Follow your dog, Abner Briggs," said Master Langdon. The stout butcher youth looked round, but the rebels were all cowed and sat still. "I'll go when I'm ready," he said, "and I guess I won't go afore I'm ready." "You're ready now," said Master Langdon, turning up his cuffs so that the little boys noticed the yellow gleam of a pair of gold sleeve buttons, once worn by Colonel Percy Wentworth, famous in the old French war. Abner Briggs, Jr., did not apparently think he was ready, at any rate, for he rose up in his place and stood with clenched fists, defiant, as the master strode towards him. The master knew the fellow was really frightened, for all his looks, and that he must have no time to rally, so he caught him suddenly by the collar, and with one great pull had him out over his desk and on the open floor. He gave him a sharp fling backwards, and stood looking at him. The rough and tumble fighters all clinch, as everybody knows, and Abner Briggs, Jr., was one of that kind. He remembered how he had floored Master Weeks, and he had just spunk enough left in him to try to repeat his former successful experiment on the new master. He sprang at him open-handed to clutch him. So the master had to strike, once, but very hard, and just in the place to tell. No doubt the authority that doth hedge a schoolmaster added to the effect of the blow, but the blow was itself a neat one, and did not require to be repeated. "Now go home," said the master, "and don't let me see you or your dog here again," and he turned his cuffs down over the gold sleeve buttons. This finished the great Pigwacket Centre School rebellion. What could be done with a master who was so pleasant as long as the boys behaved decently, and such a terrible fellow when he got riled, as they called it? In a week's time everything was reduced to order, and the school committee were delighted. The master, however, had received a proposition so much more agreeable and advantageous that he informed the committee he should leave at the end of his month, having in his eye a sensible and energetic young college graduate who would be willing and fully competent to take his place. So at the expiration of the appointed time, Bernard Langdon, late master of the school district No. 1, Pigwacket Centre, took his departure from that place for another locality, whither we shall follow him, carrying with him the regrets of the committee, of most of the scholars, and of several young ladies, also 2 locks of hair sent unbeknown to parents, 1 dark, and 1 warmish auburn, inscribed with the respective initials of Almany Cutter and Arvily Brown. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of Elsie Venner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Elsie Venner by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Chapter 4. The Moth Flies into the Candle. The invitation which Mr. Bernard Langdon had accepted came from the Board of Trustees of the Apollinian Female Institute, a school for the education of young ladies situated in the flourishing town of Rockland. This was an establishment on a considerable scale, in which 100 scholars or thereabouts were taught the ordinary English branches, several of the modern languages, something of Latin, if desired, with a little natural philosophy, metaphysics, and rhetoric, to finish off with in the last year, and music at any time when they could pay for it. At the close of their career in the Institute, they were submitted to a grand public examination, and received diplomas tied in blue ribbons, which proclaimed them, with a great flourish of capitals, to be graduates of the Apollinian Female Institute. Rockland was a town of no inconsiderable pretensions. It was ennobled by lying at the foot of a mountain, called by the working folks of the place the Mountain, which sufficiently showed that it was the principal high land of the district in which it was situated. It lay to the south of this, and basked in the sunshine as Italy stretches herself before the Alps. To pass from the town of Tamarack on the north of the mountain to Rockland on the south was like crossing from Coire to Chiavenna. There is nothing gives glory and grandeur and romance and mystery to a place like the impending presence of a high mountain. Our beautiful Northampton, with its fair meadows and noble stream, is lovely enough, but owes its surpassing attraction to those twin summits which brood over it like living presences, looking down into its streets, as if they were its tutelary divinities, dressing and undressing their green shrines, robing themselves in jubilant sunshine or in sorrowing clouds, and doing penance in the snowy shroud of winter, as if they had living hearts under their rocky ribs, and changed their mood like the children of the soil at their feet, who grow up under their almost parental smiles and frowns. Happy is the child whose first dreams of heaven are blended with the evening glories of Mount Holyoke, when the sun is firing its tree tops, and gilding the white walls that mark its one human dwelling. If the other and the wilder of the two summits has a scowl of terror in its overhanging brows, yet is it a pleasing fear to look upon its savage solitudes through the barred nursery windows in the heart of the sweet, companionable village. And how the mountains love their children! The sea is of a facile virtue, and will run to kiss the first comer in any port he visits. But the chaste mountains sit apart, and show their faces only in the midst of their own families. The mountain which kept watch to the north of Rockland lay waste and almost inviolate through much of its domain. The catamount still glared from the branches of its old hemlocks on the lesser beasts that strayed beneath him. It was not long since a wolf had wandered down, famished in the winter's dearth, and left a few bones and some tufts of wool of what had been a lamb in the morning. Nay, there were broad-footed tracks in the snow only 2 years previously, which could not be mistaken. The black bear alone could have set that plantigrade seal, and little children must come home early from school and play, for he is an indiscriminate feeder when he is hungry, and a little child would not come amiss when other game was wanting. But these occasional visitors may have been mere wanderers, which, straying along in the woods by day, and perhaps stalking through the streets of still villages by night, had worked their way along down from the ragged mountain spurs of higher latitudes. The one feature of the mountain that shed the brownest horror on its woods was the existence of the terrible region known as Rattlesnake Ledge, and still tenanted by those damnable reptiles which distill a fiercer venom under our cold northern sky than the cobra himself in the land of tropical spices and poisons. From the earliest settlement of the place, this fact had been, next to the Indians, the reigning nightmare of the inhabitants. It was easy enough, after a time, to drive away the savages, for a screeching Indian divil, as our fathers called him, could not crawl into the crack of a rock to escape from his pursuers. But the venomous population of Rattlesnake Ledge had a Gibraltar for their fortress that might have defied the siege train dragged to the walls of Sebastopol. In its deep embrasures and its impregnable easements they reared their families, they met in love or wrath, they twined together in family knots, they hissed defiance in hostile clans, they fed, slept, hibernated, and in due time died in peace. Many a foray had the townspeople made, and many a stuffed skin was shown as a trophy. Nay, there were families where the children's first toy was made from the warning appendage that once vibrated to the wrath of one of these cruel serpents. Sometimes one of them, coaxed out by a warm sun, would writhe himself down the hillside into the roads, up the walks that led to houses. Worse than this, into the long grass, where the barefooted mowers would soon pass with their swinging scythes. More rarely into houses, and on one memorable occasion, early in the last century, into the meeting house, where he took a position on the pulpit stairs, as is narrated in the account of some remarkable providences, etc., where it is suggested that a strong tendency of the Reverend Didymus Bean, the minister at that time, towards the Arminian heresy, may have had something to do with it, and that the serpent supposed to have been killed on the pulpit stairs was a false show of the demon's contrivance, he having come in to listen to a discourse which was a sweet savour in his nostrils, and, of course, not being capable of being killed himself. Others said, however, that though there was good reason to think it was a demon, yet he did come with intent to bite the heel of that faithful servant, etc. One Gilson is said to have died of the bite of a rattlesnake in this town early in the present century. After this there was a great snake hunt, in which very many of these venomous beasts were killed. One in particular said to have been as big round as a stout man's arm, and to have had no less than 40 joints to his rattle, indicating, according to some, that he had lived 40 years. But if we might put any faith in the Indian tradition that he had killed 40 human beings, an idle fancy clearly. This hunt, however, had no permanent effect in keeping down the serpent population. Viviparous creatures are a kind of specie-paying lot, but oviparous ones only give their notes, as it were, for a future brood, an egg being, so to speak, a promise to pay a young one by and by, if nothing happen. Now, the domestic habits of the rattlesnake are not studied very closely, for obvious reasons, but it is, no doubt, to all intents and purposes, oviparous. Consequently, it has large families, and it is not easy to kill out. In the year 1840 something, a melancholy proof was afforded to the inhabitants of Rockland that the brood which infested the mountain was not extirpated. A very interesting young married woman, detained at home at the time by the state of her health, was bitten in the entry of her own house by a rattlesnake which had found its way down from the mountain. Owing to the almost instant employment of powerful remedies, the bite did not prove immediately fatal, but she died within a few months of the time when she was bitten. All this seemed to throw a lurid kind of shadow over the mountain, yet as many years passed without any accident, people grew comparatively careless, and it might rather be said to add a fearful kind of interest to the romantic hillside, that the banded reptiles, which had been the terror of the red men for nobody knows how many thousand years, were there still, with the same poison bags and spring teeth at the white men's service, if they meddled with them. The other natural features of Rockland were such as many of our pleasant country towns can boast of. A brook came tumbling down the mountain side and skirted the most thickly settled portion of the village. In the parts of its course where it ran through the woods, the water looked almost as brown as coffee flowing from its urn. To say like smoky quartz would perhaps give a better idea, but in the open plain it sparkled over the pebbles white as a queen's diamonds. There were huckleberry pastures on the lower flanks of the mountain, with plenty of the sweet-scented mayberry mingled with the other bushes. In other fields grew great store of high-bush blackberries. Along the roadside were bayberry bushes, hung all over with bright red coral pendants in autumn and far into the winter. Then there were swamps set thick with dingy alders, where the three-leaved arum and the skunk's cabbage grew broad and succulent, shelving down into black boggy pools here and there, at the edge of which the green frog, stupidest of his tribe, sat waiting to be victimized by boy or snapping turtle, long after the shy and agile leopard frog had taken the 6-foot spring that plumped him into the middle of the pool. And on the neighboring banks the maidenhair spread its flat disk of embroidered fronds on the wire-like stem that glistened polished and brown as the darkest tortoise-shell, and pale violets, cheated by the cold skies of their hues and perfume, sunned themselves like white-cheeked invalids. Over these rose the old forest trees, the maple scarred with the wounds which had drained away its sweet life-blood, the beech, its smooth grey bark mottled so as to look like the body of one of those great snakes of old that used to frighten armies, always the mark of lovers' knives, as in the days of Musidora and her swain, the yellow birch, rough as the breast of Silenus in old marbles, the wild cherry, its little bitter fruit lying unheeded at its foot, and soaring over all, the huge, coarse-barked, splintery-limbed, dark-mantled hemlock, in the depth of whose aerial solitudes the crow brooded on her nest unscared, and the grey squirrel lived unharmed till his incisors grew to look like ram's horns. Rockland would have been but half a town without its pond. Guinea-pig Pond was the name of it, but the young ladies of the Apollinian Institute were very anxious that it should be called Crystalline Lake. It was here that the young folks used to sail in summer and skate in winter. Here, too, those queer, old, rum-scented, good-for-nothing, lazy, story-telling, half vagabonds, who sawed a little wood or dug a few potatoes now and then, under the pretense of working for their living, used to go and fish through the ice for pickerel every winter. And here those 3 young people were drowned a few summers ago by the upsetting of a sailboat in a sudden flaw of wind. There is not one of these smiling ponds which has not devoured more youths and maidens than any of those monsters the ancients used to tell such lies about. But it was a pretty pond, and never looked more innocent, so the native bard of Rockland said in his elegy, than in the morning when they found Sarah Jane and Ellen Maria floating among the lily pads. The Apollinian Institute, or Institute as it was more commonly called, was, in the language of its prospectus, a first-class educational establishment. It employed a considerable corps of instructors to rough out and finish the 100 young lady scholars it sheltered beneath its roof. First, Mr. and Mrs. Peckham, the principal and the matron of the school. Silas Peckham was a thorough Yankee, born on a windy part of the coast, and reared chiefly on salt fish. Everybody knows the type of Yankee produced by this climate and diet, thin as if he had been split and dried, with an ashen kind of complexion, like the tint of the food he is made of, and about as sharp, tough, juiceless, and biting to deal with as the other is to the taste. Silas Peckham kept a young ladies' school exactly as he would have kept 100 head of cattle, for the simple, unadorned purpose of making just as much money in just as few years as could be safely done. Mr. Peckham gave very little personal attention to the department of instruction, but was always busy with contracts for flour and potatoes, beef and pork, and other nutritive staples, the amount of which required for such an establishment was enough to frighten a quartermaster. Mrs. Peckham was from the West, raised on Indian corn and pork, which gave a fuller outline and a more humid temperament, but may perhaps be thought to render people a little coarse-fibred. Her specialty was to look after the feathering, cackling, roosting, rising, and general behavior of these 100 chicks. An honest, ignorant woman, she could not have passed an examination in the youngest class. So this distinguished institution was under the charge of a commissary and a housekeeper, and its real business was making money by taking young girls in as boarders. Connected with this, however, was the incidental fact which the public took for the principal one, namely, the business of instruction. Mr. Peckham knew well enough that it was just as well to have good instructors as bad ones, so far as cost was concerned, and a great deal better for the reputation of his feeding establishment. He tried to get the best he could without paying too much, and having got them, to screw all the work out of them that could possibly be extracted. There was a master for the English branches, with a young lady assistant. There was another young lady who taught French, of the avant and bondang style, which does not exactly smack of the asphalt of the boulevards. There was also a German teacher of music, who sometimes helped in French, of the enfant and batang style, so that between the two, the young ladies could hardly have been mistaken for Parisians by a committee of the French Academy. The German teacher also taught a Latin class after his fashion, bene, aben, gaboot, ahead, and so forth. The master for the English branches had lately left the school for private reasons, which need not here be mentioned, but he had gone at any rate, and it was his place which had been offered to Mr. Bernard Langdon. The offer came just in season, as, for various causes, he was willing to leave the place where he had begun his new experience. It was on a fine morning that Mr. Bernard, ushered in by Mr. Peckham, made his appearance in the great schoolroom of the Apollonian Institute. A general rustle ran all round the seats when the handsome young man was introduced. The principal carried him to the desk of the young lady English assistant, Miss Darley by name, and introduced him to her. There was not a great deal of study done that day. The young lady assistant had to point out to the new master the whole routine in which the classes were engaged when their late teacher left, and which had gone on as well as it could since. Then Master Langdon had a great many questions to ask, some relating to his new duties, and some, perhaps, implying a degree of curiosity not very unnatural under the circumstances. The truth is, the general effect of the schoolroom, with its scores of young girls, all their eyes naturally centering on him, with fixed or furtive glances, was enough to bewilder and confuse a young man like Master Langdon, though he was not destitute of self-possession, as we have already seen. You cannot get together 100 girls, taking them as they come, from the comfortable and affluent classes, probably anywhere, certainly not in New England, without seeing a good deal of beauty. In fact, we very commonly mean by beauty the way young girls look when there is nothing to hinder their looking as nature meant them to. And the great schoolroom of the Apollonian Institute did really make so pretty a show on the morning when Master Langdon entered it, that he might be pardoned for asking Miss Darley more questions about his scholars than about their lessons. There were girls of all ages, little creatures, some pallid and delicate looking, the offspring of invalid parents, much given to books, not much to mischief, commonly spoken of as particularly good children, and contrasted with another sort, girls of more vigorous organization, who were disposed to laughing and play, and required a strong hand to manage them. Then young growing misses of every shade of Saxon complexion, here and there one of more southern hue, blondes, some of them so translucent looking that it seemed as if you could see the souls in their bodies, like bubbles in glass, if souls were object of sight. Brunettes, some with rose-red colors, and some with that swarthy hue which often carries with it a heavily shaded lip, and which, with pure outlines and outspoken reliefs, gives us some of our handsomest women, the women whom ornaments of plain gold adorn more than any other peruse. And again, but only here and there, one with dark hair and gray or blue eyes, a Celtic type, perhaps, but found in our native stock occasionally. Rarest of all, a light-haired girl with dark eyes, hazel, brown, or of the color of that mountain brook spoken of in this chapter, where it ran through shadowy woodlands. With these were to be seen at intervals some of maturer years, full-blown flowers among the opening buds, with that conscious look upon their faces which so many women wear during the period when they never meet a single man without having his monosyllable ready for him, tied as they are, poor things, on the rock of expectation, each of them an Andromeda waiting for her Perseus. "Who is that girl in ringlets, the fourth in the third row on the right?" said Master Langdon. "Charlotte Ann Wood," said Miss Darley, "writes very pretty poems." "Oh, and the pink one, 3 seats from her. Looks bright. Anything in her?" "Emma Dean, day scholar, Squire Dean's daughter. Nice girl, second medal last year." The master asked these 2 questions in a careless kind of way, and did not seem to pay any too much attention to the answers. "And who and what is that," he said, "sitting a little apart there, that strange, wild-looking girl?" This time he put the real question he wanted answered. The other 2 were asked at random, as masks for the third. The lady teacher's face changed. One would have said she was frightened or troubled. She looked at the girl doubtfully, as if she might hear the master's question and its answer. But the girl did not look up. She was winding a gold chain about her wrist, and then uncoiling it, as if in a kind of reverie. Miss Darley drew close to the master, and placed her hand, so as to hide her lips. "Don't look at her as if we were talking about her," she whispered softly. "That is Elsie Venner." Chapter 4.